Now, for more on the SANDF story, let's speak to Pikkie Greef, who is the National Secretary of the South African National Defence Union. Pikkie, thank you so much for joining us. A tragedy of a story to talk about here. As a union, you have sent your condolences.
Yes, it is indeed a tragic story. We've sent our condolences. That was, of course, earlier this morning when we only knew about 3 casualties. In the meantime, the Defence Force has issued a formal statement indicating that, in fact, there are formally admitted to 9 casualties. So really a tragic day or few days for South Africa.
And Pikkie, if you could just explain, because obviously, you know, we've had troops in the DRC for decades. The war has been going on there with the conflict there. If you could just take us back to how our SANDF members arrived there for those who need a little bit of history.
Well, I think the first deployments took place way back in the middle of the 2000s. When there was a United Nations deployment to do some peacekeeping. And it's actually the same conflict that is concerned, which is there is various rebel groups, in fact, that are trying on the eastern side or area of the DRC who are fighting the formal DRC government and trying to oust the government and have their own set of political demands. Anyway, since South Africa and the UN got involved in the mid-2000s, we've managed to largely contain those rebel groups, which are said to be backed by the bordering Rwanda, as they share the same ethnicity and ideologies, etc. Basically, they died down a bit about 7 or so years ago when we had a full intervention there with the UN, and gradually, as they retreated, it seems that they in fact regrouped, and in the past couple of years especially, they have resurged in the area, newly armed, and of course with a new generation of fighters as well. And in the meantime, the UN has downscaled it, in fact is moving its deployment out. And so what happened was that the SADC countries decided that the situation is not stable enough, and that they decided to send a combined force from South Africa and other SADC countries to the DRC, of course with the DRC's permission or authority and request. And that is the mission that we are currently looking at in this news cycle, where the battles between the M23 rebels and those forces of the SADC countries, which are mainly South African force or troops at this stage, is raging the past couple of days. They've tried to take Goma, which is the capital city of that eastern province in the DRC. But between them and Goma, there is a town called Sake, and there is a base of the SADC countries, which is basically manned by South African troops. And that is the base and the town that is currently under attack by the rebels.
And Pikkie, you just also reminded us of, you know, the UN withdrawing its troops as well. I think it began last year to start phasing out and withdrawing some of its troops. So how critical of a role does the SANDF now play in the DRC?
Well, no, absolutely essential there. I mean, we've got some of the best equipment and the best trained soldiers as well. And of course, we're the largest contingent of soldiers amongst these SADC countries that are deploying there. The UN's withdrawal is really not good news, but one must stress that that took place on the demand of the DRC government, who was not apparently satisfied with the performance. And of course, when the Russian-Ukraine war also started, a lot of the Ukrainian equipment and troops that were used, especially the helicopters that were used, were withdrawn by Ukraine. And in the meantime, also the South African, all the South African air support has been withdrawn because they were closely connected to the UN anyway. So the SADC mission, we don't have any South African air support. We don't have much logistical support to speak of. And we've been, you know, at Newzroom Afrika, you'll know we've been on several interviews on the show and on with other anchors as well, where we stressed our concern, and even at the start of this deployment, that our soldiers are under-equipped and under-supported in this deployment.
And over time, we hear again and again about, you know, killings. Earlier, we were speaking to Professor Ngomezulu, and he was saying, look, it's the nature of the job, as tragic as it is as well. But when you withdraw those UN troops in their thousands, yes, at the behest of the DRC government as well, Is it then replaced by other troops, or is it then all incumbent on the South African troops to make sure that things are curbed there?
There is still quite a large element of the UN station in the DRC. They haven't completely disappeared. I think that's just something one has to understand also, but obviously their mandate has been all but cancelled. Yeah, so everything does bear on the SADC deployment. Most of it does. And that's why it's so important. And I think although we have also taken the point of view that obviously part of being a soldier and deploying and getting into a battle zone is that you put your life at risk, I think the bigger point is that your life is less at risk if you're properly equipped and properly supported.
Now, Pikkie, since the displacement, since 1996, we've seen at least 6 million people being displaced in the DRC. The situation doesn't seem to be getting any better. What do you think the solutions are here? Is it just to continue sending in more troops?
No ways. I think any military intervention, and this is what the military analysts and defense experts will also tell you, is that this is the kind of conflict that just will never end. There will never be a military victory. The best that military intervention can achieve is to create circumstances which is adequate and conducive for the parties to sit down and have peace talks. I'm afraid the way it's going now, we're far from that moment, and there's probably still much fighting that will go on. One, of course, hopes that's not the case. But as I say, the best the military intervention can do is buy time to create conditions to sit down with peace talks.
When we're looking at what's going on in the world in terms of conflicts and wars, when we look at what's going on in the Middle East, when we look at what's going on also in South Sudan, and of course the Ukraine-Russia conflict as well, it seems as if there is a lot for us to be focusing on. But do you think because this conflict in the DRC has been taking place for, over 2 decades now, it's kind of taken a back burner?
Well, one does get the impression that, it's taken some of the back burner. I mean, there's terrible atrocities also going on just further north in Africa and the Sudan and so on in those conflicts. And that doesn't get much of a cycle in the news either. I do think it has kind of slipped the attention of most of the world. And, it's really for us to keep the attention on it and to see to it that there can be a peaceful solution.
And today we're speaking about this because, of course, there were 9 people who were killed here. But on a daily, we see soldiers as well who are getting injured. In this attack alone, there were at least 14 other SANDF members who were seriously injured as well. Take us through just that kind of scenario as well, that, of course, death is the worst one, but also the injuries that these soldiers have to face.
I think it's worth noting, and it's very tragic to say so, but the sad reality is that the 9 casualties that we've suffered the past 48 hours or so is the heaviest casualties South Africa or the SANDF has suffered in the past 11 years. That's since 2013, actually 12 years. In the Battle of Bangui, because remember, this is now seen as one military conflict, as a military conflict that's been raging the past few days, a battle, in fact. And so that's the heaviest losses we've taken in 13 years. And one will usually find that your heavier losses come especially when you have not had proper support. That was the issue in Bangui, and we believe that's the issue here as well. And then, of course, with the 18 injured, it's difficult to say because the Defence Force doesn't really point out in their statement, nor does do any of the other reports. It doesn't say whether it's injury, which is, normal injuries that might occur, such as accidents or whatever the case may be, or whether it's injuries through being wounded. We understand from the description of the injuries that it's basically due to shrapnel wounding the legs and the lower body of the soldiers that are injured. There are some head injuries and so on. But again, the more fatalities and the bigger the injuries, etc., that's usually an indication of inadequate support and resources. That could probably have been more minimal. And I don't think we must downplay the numbers of these casualties and injuries. They are definitely serious and they are quite heavy.
And as you're speaking of just the lack of clarity as well, in your statement earlier, I quote, you had said that this incident raises a couple of critical questions, and one being that, has the president been made fully aware of these casualties, and the lack of communication has become all too common with SANDF leadership, keeping the public and even at times ministers in the dark for far too long. Tell us more about this just lack of communication that you've seen over time.
It's unfortunately seems to be a legacy in the Department of Defense that there is a veil of secrecy once it comes to any operation or deployment. And when something happens to our troops, then immediately, all information is closed down and the department simply does not communicate with the public. Well, that's at least the impression we've been getting, especially the past couple of years. We know that there was a veil of silence over Bangui for quite a few days before the story started coming out and the facts started leaking into the public domain. And it shouldn't be that way. What we are simply saying as a union is that the Defence Force and the SANDF has the duty to keep the public informed of developments like these on an almost real-time basis. And if not on a real-time basis, then at least right after or shortly after they've unfolded. The fact that they only tonight announced the nine casualties and the injuries when they could have done so over the past 48 to 72 hours, that's something that we should be very concerned of, because in the meantime, we sit with families at home who have to get their information from all kinds of other sources except official ones. And they start worrying when they hear about casualties and injuries, because there's no way for them to know unless the Defence Force approaches them. And for the rest of those who were fortunate enough not to have family members deployed there and who are injured or either killed, at least when the names are published after the families are informed, at least then they also know that their loved ones are safe. Otherwise, we just sit with a public that's speculating, on social media and so on, and it really creates uncertainty and it really creates a lack of trust in the Defence Force from the public's perspective, especially from the family members of deployed members.
Yeah. Now, when you speak of this veil of secrecy as well, when you as a union approach the department or government regarding this, and there are examples that you've used as well that you can cite, what response are you getting?
Well, the usual response that we would get is that the department is working on a communique in this regard and will shortly be publishing something to the public. And I'm, quite disturbed to say that the past 48 hours, that is what we have been told every day. And in fact, some journalists and other defense analysts have told me the same thing also. Really, it's for the Department of Defense to rethink its strategy on communication. Clear and decisive and immediate communication, even in the middle of a crisis, or especially in the middle of a crisis, is always better than simply remaining silent.
Pikkie Greef, thank you so much for joining us this evening and talking to us on the back of that breaking news story coming out of the Democratic Republic of Congo. 9 SANDF soldiers have been killed there, with at least 14 or so who have been injured.